This is your need to know. This is your need to know.
Welcome to our deep dive into the world of knowledge. You provided us with a really interesting mix of articles and research, and we're here to help you sift through it all and pull out the most fascinating bits. Basically, we're tackling the big questions. What is knowledge, really? Where does it come from? And why should you care?
What's really interesting is that your sources don't just define knowledge, they actually break it down into different types. We're talking declarative, procedural, even empirical knowledge, which gives you a much deeper understanding than just saying, oh, it's stuff you know.
Right. Okay, so let's start with the basics then. The Wikipedia article on declarative knowledge defines it as an awareness of facts that can be expressed using declarative sentences. So things you can declare as true or false. Seems simple enough, right?
It is on the surface, but it gets more complex when you start thinking about how we know those facts are true. And that's where epistemology comes in the study of knowledge itself.
So it's not just about knowing stuff, it's about knowing how you know that stuff.
Exactly. And traditionally, philosophers have said that knowledge has to meet three criteria: belief, truth, and justification. So you have to believe it, it has to actually be true, and that belief has to be justified.
So if I believe I can fly, but I jump off a building and plummet, that belief wasn't knowledge because it wasn't true, no matter how much faith I had.
Precisely. But it's not enough for something to just be true either. You also need justification. So let's say you guess the winning lottery numbers. You're right, it's true. But did you have knowledge of those numbers beforehand?
Not unless I had some kind of insider information. Or a time machine. It was just a lucky guess.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because philosophers debate whether justification comes from inside our minds, like a strong feeling of certainty, or if it comes from outside factors, like evidence and proof.
So an internalist might say, I just know this painting is a forgery, just based on a gut feeling, while an externalist would want to see expert analysis and historical records before claiming knowledge.
Exactly. And this debate isn't just for, dusty philosophy books. It affects how we approach everything from scientific discoveries to personal decisions. Think about it. How much do you rely on gut feelings versus concrete evidence in your own life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to that now. But before we go too deep down that rabbit hole, let's get back to the types of knowledge. The Wikipedia article also mentions a priori and a posteriori knowledge. What's the difference?
Think of it like this. A priori knowledge is what you can figure out just by thinking, without needing any experience of the world. Like math is a great example. That 2 + 2 = 4, no matter what's going on around you.
Okay, so it's like knowing that a square has 4 sides. It's built into the definition. No need to go out and measure squares in the real world.
Exactly. A posteriori knowledge, on the other hand, comes from experience. For example, knowing what your favorite food tastes like. You can't figure that out just by thinking about it. You have to actually taste it.
So a lot of scientific knowledge would be a posteriori, then right, because we learn about the world through observations and experiments.
Precisely. And this means that a posteriori knowledge relies heavily on empirical evidence, stuff we can see, hear, touch, or measure.
Now, the Wikipedia article also mentions that there's more to knowledge than just knowing facts. It talks about things like domain-specific knowledge versus general knowledge and knowledge of concepts and principles.
Yeah.
It seems like we're moving beyond just memorizing trivia here.
Absolutely. Imagine you're a huge fan of a particular band and you know all their lyrics by heart. That's domain-specific knowledge. But understanding the broader principles of music theory, things like melody, harmony, or rhythm, that's general knowledge. That's applicable to any genre.
So to really understand something, we need a blend of all these types of knowledge.
Exactly. And your sources even challenge the idea that knowledge is only about facts, beliefs, and justifications. Think about practical skills, like knowing how to ride a bike. You might not be able to explain the physics behind it, but you can do it.
Yeah, I've been riding a bike since I was a kid. But if you asked me to write a manual on how to balance and steer, I'd be clueless.
Exactly. And that's a form of knowledge called procedural knowledge or tacit knowledge, knowing how to do things without necessarily being able to explain them.
That makes me wonder, is tasting chocolate a type of knowledge? It's not a fact or a skill, but it's definitely something you know once you've experienced it.
You've hit on a really interesting point. That's knowledge by acquaintance. a kind of direct, intimate knowing that comes from experience, and it shows just how multifaceted this whole concept of knowledge really is. Welcome back to our deep dive into the nature of knowledge.
And we're picking up right where we left off, talking about all the different ways we know things. Even if we can't always explain them, that leads us to something called procedural knowledge, right? The knowing how, as opposed to just knowing that.
Exactly. Procedural knowledge is all about skills and actions, like the difference between, knowing the rules of a game and actually being able to play it well.
So things like riding a bike or cooking a meal or even just having a conversation, those all rely on procedural knowledge, right? Because we're not consciously thinking about every step. We just kind of do it.
That's right. And a key feature of procedural knowledge is that it's often implicit or tacit, meaning we might not be able to explain exactly how we do it, even though we can do it, flawlessly.
It's like when you try to teach someone how to tie their shoelaces.
Yeah,
It seems so simple to you, but explaining the steps can be surprisingly difficult.
precisely. And that highlights the difference between declarative and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is easy to share, you just state the facts. But procedural knowledge is embedded in our actions, our habits, sometimes even our muscle memory.
Right? It's like the difference between reading a recipe and actually baking a cake.
Yeah.
You can have all the declarative knowledge about the ingredients and the techniques, but until you get your hands dirty and actually start doing it, you won't have that procedural knowledge.
Yeah. Exactly. And think about how much of our daily lives relies on procedural knowledge. Things like driving a car, using a smartphone, even recognizing faces. We take these skills for granted, but they involve really complex processes that we've mastered through experience.
So how do we gain this kind of knowledge? Is it just a matter of practice, practice, practice?
Practice is definitely key, but there's more to it than that. One fascinating theory is that we learn procedural knowledge through a process called chunking.
Chunking? That sounds intriguing. What does that mean?
It's like taking a complex skill and breaking it down into smaller, more manageable chunks. So imagine learning a dance routine, for example. At first, you focus on each individual step, but with practice, those steps become chunks that flow together seamlessly.
So instead of thinking step, step, turn, step, it becomes one fluid chunk of movement.
Exactly. And as those chunks become more automatic, it frees up mental space to focus on other aspects of the dance, like expression, rhythm, connecting with your partner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like learning to type. At first, you're hunting and pecking for each letter, but eventually you're typing whole words and phrases without even thinking about the individual keys.
Precisely. And this chunking process, it applies to all sorts of skills. From playing a musical instrument to coding software to mastering a sport, it's amazing how our brains can take these complex processes and make them feel effortless.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, knowledge by acquaintance. The Wikipedia article uses the example of tasting chocolate. Could that also be seen as a form of procedural knowledge? Because there's a certain knowing how involved in discerning the subtle flavors and aromas.
That's a sharp observation, and it shows how the lines between different types of knowledge can definitely blur. So tasting chocolate could be seen as both knowledge by acquaintance, that direct sensory experience, and a form of procedural knowledge, the skill of using your senses to analyze and appreciate what you're tasting.
Okay, so we've covered declarative knowledge, the knowing that, and procedural knowledge, the knowing how. But what about empirical knowledge? How does that fit into the puzzle?
So empirical knowledge is closely tied to a posteriori knowledge gained through experience. But it really emphasizes the role of evidence in shaping what we know. And the Wikipedia article on empirical evidence highlights how it relies on observation, experimentation, and testing hypotheses.
So it's not just about having experiences, it's about systematically gathering information to support or challenge what we think we know.
Exactly. Think about the scientific method. We start with a question or a hypothesis. Then we design experiments to collect data. And then we analyze that data to draw conclusions. The whole process is driven by this search for empirical evidence.
Okay, so a scientist might hypothesize that a certain type of fertilizer helps plants grow faster. And to gain empirical knowledge, they'd have to design a controlled experiment, carefully measure the results, and then use that data to either support or refute their hypothesis.
Exactly. And this reliance on evidence is what sets scientific knowledge apart from other types of beliefs. It's not enough to just have a hunch or a strong opinion. You need solid evidence to back it up.
And the Wikipedia article emphasizes the importance of the scientific method in generating reliable empirical evidence. It's like this systematic, rigorous approach that's designed to minimize bias and ensure that our conclusions are based on solid data.
That's right. The scientific method helps us avoid jumping to conclusions or letting our preconceived notions, color our interpretations. And one crucial element of this method is the idea of falsifiability.
Falsifiability, what does that mean?
It means that a scientific hypothesis has to be testable, and there has to be a possibility of proving it wrong. If a claim can't be tested or disproven, it's not very useful scientifically.
So a good scientific hypothesis has to be vulnerable, in a way, open to the possibility of being wrong.
Precisely. And that's what makes science so powerful. It's self-correcting. We're constantly testing and gathering new evidence and refining our understanding of the world. It's not about being right all the time. It's about getting closer to the truth through a rigorous process.
So empirical knowledge is this never-ending process of questioning and testing and refining our understanding based on evidence. It's exciting and a bit humbling at the same time, realizing that we might not have all the answers right now.
That's the beauty of it. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to discover.
All this talk about evidence and testing makes me wonder, if we're always open to new information and revising our beliefs, can we ever be truly certain about anything? Is there always a chance we could be wrong?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it brings us to the fascinating and sometimes unsettling realm of philosophical skepticism.
Okay, things are getting deep now. Skepticism sounds like some serious doubt.
You could say that it takes the idea that we could be mistaken about our beliefs and kind of pushes it to the limit. So philosophical skepticism asks, can we really know anything for sure?
So it's not just about questioning specific facts, but questioning the very foundation of how we know anything at all.
Exactly. And there are different degrees of skepticism. Some skeptics flat out deny that knowledge is even possible, while others are more moderate. They just urge us to suspend judgment when we don't have enough evidence.
Can you give me an example of a skeptical argument that might make us question our everyday beliefs?
Certainly. One classic thought experiment is the brain in a vat scenario. So imagine a brain separated from its body, floating in a vat of nutrients. And this brain is hooked up to a supercomputer that feeds it simulated sensory experiences, sights, sounds, smells, everything.
So this brain is living in a totally artificial reality, but it has no way of knowing that. That's a wild thought.
It is. And the skeptic's question is this: how can you be sure that you're not a brain in a vat right now? All your experiences could be simulations.
Whoa, that's making my head spin. I mean, I feel pretty sure I'm not a brain in a vat, but how can I prove it?
That's the point of skeptical arguments. They force us to confront the limits of what we can know for certain, and to acknowledge the possibility of error. Now, there are counter-arguments to skepticism. Of course, philosophers have been debating these issues for centuries. But at its core, skepticism is about encouraging critical thinking, questioning assumptions, and being open to the idea that we might be wrong.
So even if we can't achieve absolute certainty, skepticism can help us refine our beliefs and become more discerning about what we accept as knowledge. It's like a mental workout for our critical thinking skills.
That's a great way to put it. Just like a physical workout strengthens our bodies, skepticism can strengthen our minds, making us more resilient to misinformation and dogma.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
But speaking of workouts, I think my brain needs a little break from all this deep thinking. We've covered a lot of ground today, different types of knowledge, how we gain them, the challenges of skepticism.
It's been a fascinating exploration, and we've only just scratched the surface of what your sources have to offer. There's so much more to uncover.
This is your need to know. This is your need to know.
I'm ready for round two. Let's dive back in and see what other insights we can unearth about the nature of knowledge. Welcome back to our deep dive into the nature of knowledge. We've been talking about different ways we know things and even the challenges of skepticism. It's been a real mind bender.
It has. And, connecting all this back to the bigger picture, one thing that hasn't been explicitly stated is, the purpose of knowledge. Like, why do we even bother to learn and understand things? Is it all just about collecting facts, or is there something more to it?
That's a really good question. Well, we talked about the practical value of knowledge, how it helps us solve problems, make decisions, navigate the world around us. But yeah, could there be like a deeper purpose? Something beyond just utility?
Well, many philosophers throughout history have argued that knowledge is intimately tied to our sense of self, our purpose, even our happiness.
So it's not just about what we know, but how that knowing shapes who we are, how we see ourselves and our place in the world.
Precisely. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And he believed that the pursuit of knowledge, especially self-knowledge, was essential to living a virtuous and fulfilling life.
So it's not just about knowing all these facts and figures about the world out there. It's also about understanding our own inner world.
Right.
Our thoughts, emotions, motivations, values.
Exactly. And this journey of self-discovery can be just as challenging and rewarding as exploring the external world. It takes honesty, a willingness to look inward, and the courage to confront our own, biases and limitations.
It makes you think about all the different ways we learn and grow throughout life. Like there's formal education, of course,
Right.
but also the knowledge we gain through experiences, relationships, our successes and failures. It's like we're constantly absorbing information, kind of weaving it into this tapestry of our understanding of ourselves and the world.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's a lifelong process of refining our understanding, expanding our capacity for wisdom and compassion.
Speaking of wisdom, I'm curious about how that's cultivated. Is it simply a matter of accumulating enough knowledge and experience, or is there something more to it?
Well, wisdom is often seen as the culmination of knowledge, experience, and values. But it also involves a certain way of being in the world. It's about having a deep understanding of yourself and your place in the grand scheme of things, and letting that understanding guide your perceptions, your thoughts, your actions.
So a wise person might not necessarily have all the answers, but they have a certain clarity of vision, a sense of perspective that allows them to navigate the complexities of life with grace and insight.
Exactly. Wisdom involves seeing beyond the surface, recognizing patterns and connections that others might miss. It's about making choices that are not only intelligent, but also ethical, compassionate, aligned with the greater good.
That makes me think about, individuals who are revered for their wisdom. Figures like Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, they each had this profound understanding of the world, but also this incredible sense of empathy that guided their actions and inspired so many people.
And if we look at their lives, we often find that their wisdom was forged through adversity, through these really challenging experiences that forced them to confront their own limitations and develop a deeper understanding of the human condition.
So it's not just about possessing knowledge, but about integrating that knowledge into our lives, letting it shape who we are and how we interact with the world.
Precisely. Wisdom is about action. It's about using what we know to make a positive impact, to create something better, to leave the world a little brighter than we found it.
This has been such a fascinating exploration. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of what constitutes knowledge to these bigger questions about its purpose and how it connects to wisdom and a meaningful life.
It's been a real privilege to dive into these sources with you. They've provided a wealth of information and sparked some truly insightful conversations.
And for you, our listener, as you continue on your own journey of learning and discovery, remember that knowledge is a powerful tool. It's not just about accumulating facts, it's about cultivating wisdom, embracing curiosity, and using what you know to make a positive impact on the world.
And never stop questioning, challenging assumptions, being open to new perspectives. The pursuit of knowledge is a lifelong adventure, and there's always something new to discover.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of knowledge. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those brains buzzing.